This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Who runs America? This week's guests, author Joel Kotkin and Professor Janine Wedel, say it's an elite that is sometimes progressive and sometimes corporate, but in either case, unaccountable to the public. And Bill Press talks with Joe Romm, a climate expert, about the U.S. China agreement to cut carbon emissions. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen. Then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Author Joel Kotkin describes the growing power of a Democratic Party elite composed of bureaucrats, professors, and media whose ideology thrills people in Manhattan and Malibu, but is out of touch with the rest of America. And we're joined now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, by Joel Kotkin. He's an internationally recognized authority on global economic, political, and social trends, also the author of a new book called The New Class Conflict. Joel Kotkin, thanks so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
That's my pleasure.
Your book is about the growing income inequality in America, yet you blame not just Republican trickle-down theory, but some unlikely sources as well, namely Democrats in Silicon Valley. What role do they play?
Well, there are several different things that have happened. One is, I think that the Democrats have not addressed initially. I think they made a big mistake with the stimulus in that they didn't focus on, sort of doing a WPA, Works Progress Administration, bringing all these young people back into the workforce. They didn't do that for lots of political reasons, but I think it was a big problem. A lot of the environmental regulations can be very, very negative for manufacturing. We see this here in California, where we're just hemorrhaging the high-paid blue-collar jobs and have been doing it for quite a long time. And that has a very negative effect. And, frankly, Bernanke, used the same theory whether he was working for Bush or working for President Obama. He was, we have to keep the big financial institutions happy, and we have to have, a regime that helps Wall Street, so that will trickle down. I mean, I think there's been as much or more trickle down under President Obama as we saw under President Reagan, perhaps more so.
Now, you compare the increasingly digitized economy to the Industrial Revolution. How does it affect the class war you write about?
Well, here's a very dangerous thing. The founders of if you go back to the last Industrial Revolution at the turn of the 20th century, those people, whether it was Carnegie or Rockefeller or later, obviously, Ford, they may have been miserable, horrible, terrible people, but they needed middle-class consumers, and they needed working-class people to work for them. They needed to employ people. The Silicon Valley employs relatively few people. The kinds of people they tend to hire are not, basically blue-collar. I mean, African-American and Hispanic incomes in Silicon Valley have actually dropped during this boom, which is very different than what we saw in the past. And I think that their agenda is really not oriented towards a broad-based economy. We're here in California. We have a lot of Silicon Valley backing renewable energy and this and that, and all these subsidies have ended up with very, very high electricity costs. Sometimes 40-50% above the national average. Well, if you're building a semiconductor plant, you're not going to build it in California because the cost of electricity alone will bankrupt you. So a lot of the sometimes well-intentioned policies, and I would argue that when we drive industry out of a place like California, which doesn't require the energy usage that, let's say, a plant in Texas would require, we're actually having a negative effect. It's not like, Intel isn't going to build a plant. They're going to build it somewhere. They're just not going to build it in a place where actually the emissions would be lower.
That's interesting.
Or into China, which is obviously even worse.
Right, absolutely. Now I guess we need to get a definition here. What is the middle class? We recently saw a defeated Democratic senator in a campaign debate define it as people making $200,000 or $300,000 a year. That's a problem, isn't it?
Well, I think it really depends where you are. I think in New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco, it is middle income. I mean, $200,000, $300,000. But when you go through the cost of living, the taxes, particularly the housing prices, a person making $200,000 in New York lives in many ways much worse than somebody who makes $100,000 in Omaha, in terms of their housing, what they can afford, how much disposable income. So it's you really almost have to adjust it by region. Where do you live is probably as much as important in this definition. I try to look at the percentile. And I generally look at people making somewhere between 40 and 80%. But again, if you're of the median income, but again, it's got to be in that region, because the cost of living, particularly the cost of housing, varies so much.
That makes it difficult to address the middle class if you're trying to do so as a candidate, I would think, then, because the middle, as you just pointed out, the middle class in New York is not necessarily the middle class in Omaha and vice versa. Right.
No, it does make it more difficult, but I think you can talk about really the vast majority. I think that the whole 1% thing even is somewhat overblown. The money has really gone to the 0.01%. I mean, that's where the vast increases in wealth are. The dentist who has a practice in Sherman Oaks and makes, $350,000 a year, he might be officially in the 1%. But he's not, he's a long way from Tom Steyer and Buffett and the Koch brothers. I mean, that's like, comparing, me playing basketball and LeBron James.
What are you saying about LeBron James? Oh, no, wait, you're saying that about you. Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to put it this way. LeBron James is a lot better than I am.
Don't sell yourself short, Joel. We're speaking to Joel Kotkin, author of the new book called The New Class Conflict. Since wealth is really no longer based on manufactured goods, doesn't that mean that only the highest educated Americans can succeed, and doesn't that in itself destroy unions in the middle class?
Well, it certainly is. Technology is certainly one of the factors, but there are a lot of opportunities. I spent a great deal of time. Almost all the cities I work in are, sort of working class cities. I don't like I'm not really a big fan of the sort of hip, cool cities. I like it where, does a city do what it's supposed to do, which in my mind is, to create opportunity for people who move there. There are jobs in the energy industry, in the logistics industry, in parts of manufacturing, in the ports, that are very high-wage jobs for blue-collar workers. And what we have done in America is we've really not emphasize those kind of skills, and so there's actually shortages developing in in the Detroits of the world. They can't replace the skilled workers they have now. I know that I do a lot of work in Houston, and the biggest constraint on home construction in Houston is they can't find the skilled workers, because all the skilled workers are working on the refineries and the petrochemical plants, which are pay better, but there's nobody to build the new houses because they can't even get the skills that they need. So, I think that there are many opportunities, particularly in what you might call that part of the economy that is not globally contested. Home building, certain kinds of quick turnaround manufacturing, logistics. These are fields where there are some possible markets, and there has been some expansion, and I think we ought to build on that. And we have to, understand that not every kid should go to a 4-year college, and that a lot of them would be better off getting a good vocational education. Yeah,
more technical skilled schools and that sort of thing.
Yes, exactly. And of course the medical field, where they need lots of technicians.
Yeah. Now, Silicon Valley, while it may have some predatory capitalists, aren't the tech billionaires actually having a positive role in using their money to solve social problems? Bill Gates comes to mind.
Well, I think Bill Gates, his philanthropy came late and had, and has some things that are good, some things are bad. To tell you the truth, I'm enough of an old radical in some senses to be a little discomforted when people like Gates or Bloomberg or the Koch brothers or Steyer have so much influence, not just on campaigns, but on social policy and increasingly on the media. I mean, there's something fundamentally worrisome to me about these, it's almost like, something out of the Middle Ages, like the War of the Roses or something, or in Japan, the dueling daimyo before Tokugawa, where these powerful people do battle with each other, and the rest of us are turned into spectators.
Yeah. Now,
I don't think that's healthy. I think, as Justice Brandeis pointed out, we can either have great concentrations of wealth, or we can have democracy, but you can't have both.
Interesting. Joel Kotkin, we're speaking with Joel Kotkin, author of the new book called The New Class Conflict. And in your book, Joel, you take an old word, clerisy, to describe an educated elite that controls the rest of society. What does the word mean literally, and what do you mean by it?
Clerisy really is, a play on, the clerical class, or what used to be in the France, the First Amendment, the First Estate, which was basically the priesthood. And what we have now is we have a growing power, whether it's in the media or in the upper bureaucracy or in academia, that basically shares a common ideology and wishes to impose it, if you will, on the rest of the country. And this is one of the areas where I think Democrats are in grave danger, because the clerisy is very powerful in the Democratic Party. It's a big part of the Democratic Party. And they're going to push policies, for instance, against single-family homes, for instance, against ways of having reasonably affordable energy that, in the faculty dining room sound great, but in the reality of day-to-day life are not so great. And this distance, I think this distance between a lot of the Democratic elites, if you will, which is largely in the clerisy, and the middle class is huge. And that really is what came out very clearly in the election. Mark Udall trying to run a campaign that I'm sure thrilled people on the Upper West Side and in Malibu, but didn't thrill people in Aurora, Colorado.
Yeah.
And so there's a lack of, because basically people live in their own world. Just like on the right, many of the conservatives thought, oh well, everybody I know is pro-life and thinks taxes are bad and every kind of tax is bad and is against gay marriage. But it turned out that that's not really where most of the people were. But if you talk only among your own kind, you kind of lose some sort of perspective on reality.
You've created a bubble.
Exactly, and I think the Democrats live in a bubble that, and they have, because let's face it, as a Jonathan Chait, who's a very liberal writer, made the point, the media is a vast left-wing conspiracy. What was the last time HBO ran a documentary that wasn't basically very much to the progressive side? When you have 96% of college professors, Ivy League college professors supporting President Obama, that's great on one level for President Obama. On the other hand, it doesn't really tell us a great deal about, a country that's pretty evenly divided politically. Mm-hmm. And so if the influence of the faculty lounge is greater, the political blindness will also be greater. Just as if you were a Republican, let's say like Bush was, and you're surrounded by all these people who have strong proclivities towards, military intervention, well, you don't talk to anyone who has a different point of view, so you make a lot of mistakes.
And there is the reason for all of our disconnect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. The fact that, and I think in a funny way, President Obama's great skill in winning over the academic world and winning over the media has a negative part, which is that I don't think he is as aware of the different points of view that are common throughout the country. I think he was very, very out of touch with where people were at, and and he paid the price.
Yeah, and there are a lot more people. You're not alone. A lot more people saying that same thing. 100 years ago, it was conservatives who sparked the environmental movement because they had a lot of property to protect. Do you see the same type of hypocrisy by progressives who want us to, quote unquote, live small, but complain about the loss of jobs, which energy and manufacturing growth would create?
Oh, well, you're right on target on that one. That's exactly what's happening. And also the other part of it is, frankly, I don't want to be told by like I was just reading a piece the other day about some big Democratic donor, a big climate change activist, who takes his yacht to work every day. And he sails this this unbelievable gas guzzling, gigantic ship from Berkeley to San Francisco every day. Mm. I mean, it's not like he's taking a rowboat, okay?
Yeah, or even a sailboat.
I spoke at the Wall Street Journal had an eco-environment conference, and I was one of the speakers. So I asked my host, I said, well, how are most of the people getting here? This was in Santa Barbara. She said, they were flying their private jets. Their private jets. It's a 4-hour drive, and a very beautiful drive. Not between San Jose and Santa Barbara, some of the nicest country in the U.S. They have to take a private plane. They can't be like the rest of us schmucks and drive or fly commercial. I mean, it's the there was a great piece written about the smart growth people in L.A. called in the L.A. Weekly called "Do As We Say, Not As We Do." And he went to the house of all the smart growth advocates, and they all lived in gated communities and big houses, not near any kind of transit line. I mean, I don't care if somebody wants to live that way. If they can afford it, that's fine. I have no problem with it. But don't tell, Mr. Ramirez and his family who are saving up to buy a house in Chino that they can't do it. They have to live small. And the other thing is, you have, and this is a bugaboo of mine, you have urban elites who say, oh, well, we live in the city. Well, first of all, if you're on an income of $100,000 a year, what exactly, for a family of four, how do you think you're going to live in L.A.? You think you're going to live nicely? I don't think so. Are you going to live near a school that you would send your kids to? I don't think so. And then they'll say, well, they shouldn't live in these suburbs because they're, environmentally poor. But meanwhile, they can afford a nice house or a big apartment in the city. And of course, you ask them, do you have a country house? And of course, they do. And this is part of the reason why the Democrats, I think, did so poorly, is that I don't want to be hectored about reducing my standard of living by people who live 100 times better than I do.
It's sort of tough to buy.
Excuse me?
It's sort of tough to buy that argument when it's coming from that direction.
Right. I mean, if it's coming from a monk with a hair shirt in a cave, at least I'll say, okay, you're living that reality. But to be told by people who live, a vastly more lavish lifestyle than I do, and certainly more lavish lifestyle than most people in the working and middle classes, I think that kind of stinks. And I think that in a funny way, the environmental movement has sort of fallen in love with celebrities and very rich people, but at the cost of losing their priorities. I mean, for instance, I'm very much in favor of buying public parks, of having long linear parks going all the way out to the suburbs, like what they're doing in Houston with the Bayou system. That but that means that the average person gets access to nature. That is something that that is not a priority for the Greens today. They're not interested in the working class kid ever having a day in the woods. That's just not. That's to me what conservation should be about, and it's no longer about.
And the other thing about that monk, he probably would have offered you a glass of port too.
That's true, and it probably would have been good.
And it would have been good, yeah. Joel Kotkin, he's the author of a new book called The New Class Conflict. Joel Kotkin, internationally recognized authority on global economic, political, and social trends, the author of a new book called The New Class Conflict, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Joel, thank you so much for your time. We'd love to have you back again soon.
Well, thank you very much.
All right, and this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight.
Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Anthropologist Janine Wedel turns her attention to the tribal rituals of Washington, telling us about unseen elites that run the country. And we'll talk to her about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
We know from the childhood song that old MacDonald had a farm. But E-I-E-I-O, look who's got his farm now. It's groups like American Farmland, Farmland Partners, and BlackRock. These aren't dirt farmers wearing overalls and brogans, but Wall Street hucksters in Armani suits and Gucci loafers. The latest fast buck fad for high roller investment trusts, hedge funds, and venture capital speculators is, quote, farming. Not that these dude ranch dandies are actually plowing and planting. No, these are soft hands people, buying up farmlands with billions of rich investors' dollars, then tilling the tax laws and threshing the farmers who do the real cultivation. For example, American Farmland Company, which owns 16 farms, is a combine of the largest real estate empire in New York City, 2 Florida sugar barons, a wealth management outfit, and the real estate brokerage arm of insurance giant Prudential. None of these nouveau sodbusters has a speck of dirt under their fingernails, but they figured out how to work the land without touching it and still harvest a sweet profit. The founder of this scheme says it's like gold, but better because there's this cash flow. Cash flow? Yes, farmers are charged rent to till the Wall Streeters' land. Then the financiers get a prime cut of any profits from the crops that the farmers produce. Also, the combine is set up as a real estate investment trust, providing an enormous tax break for the Wall Street plowboys. And, of course, there's the mega pay the moneyed elites will reap when they convert their scheme into securities for sale on the stock exchange. This is Jim Hightower saying a few rich speculators get richer, farmers are turned into sharecrop laborers, and the farms are switched to high-profit crops that require heavy pesticide dosages and soak up scarce water resources. Other than that, this is one hell of a deal.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. All those talking heads on TV, who are they? Anthropologist Janine Wedel tells us. They are elitists in politics, the military, academia, and nonprofits who have hidden agendas and are unaccountable to the public.
And we say hello to Janine Wedel, anthropologist who received her Ph.D. from the University of California, Berkeley. She is a professor at the School of Policy, Government, and International Affairs at George Mason University, and also the author of a new book, Unaccountable, How Elite Power Brokers Corrupt Our Finances, Freedom, and Security. Professor Janine Wedel, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure.
Now, your book exposes the subtle and not so subtle manipulation of public policy to benefit the rich and powerful. Why should it be surprising that the well-to-do have influence? Is it different anywhere else among societies that you've studied as an anthropologist?
No, I don't. I don't think it's different. But I think what's different today, as opposed to 20 to 30 years ago, is that we have a growing information problem that's come about through a number of different problems. One is the gutting of investigative reporting, which the backdrop to that is the growth of new information technologies, and the proliferation of different all manner of different medias, and the proliferation of different governing organizations, so that so much more of government actually outside of formal government. So you have, 3/4 of people working for federal government in Washington are actually private contractors. You have a growth of government advisory boards and so on. So developments that have led to this, led to the dispersal of governing policy decisions. And what's happened is that it's much more difficult to find out really, the upshot is that it's more difficult to find out about what people, what people are really up to. So it's not like in the kind of small town where I grew up, where the proverbial 6 degrees of separation are more like one
Right.
or two, where people know what everybody else is doing, and people's agendas, roles, relationships, and sponsors are pretty clear. When it comes to today's top power brokers, this model is only partially accurate. So you still have the same sort of small town incestuousness, but to the outside world, there's very little transparency of this kind of the community. So a top power broker might be affiliated with a university or a think tank because that gives him a neutral veneer of authority and expertise. At the same time, he might be affiliated with a consulting firm that has an agenda or an industry. So, of course, he's going to use the Harvard University or the university identification as the primary one. And we, the public, have no way or little way of knowing that that's actually what's going on.
Now, your definition of corruption calls it a violation of the public trust. What is the public trust? Is there a standard definition?
Well, so what is the public trust? So the public trust is when you can have confidence and in the efficacy of the leaders and institutions in your society, the leaders and institutions that purport to serve you and that are there ostensibly for public welfare, not just for a select few people, but for the public at large. And opinion polls show that public trust, that is, trust in institutions and leaders, is waning and has gone way down, not only in the United States, when it comes to many institutions, from Congress or Parliament to government in general to the Catholic Church, many institutions, media. So a violation of the public trust is when you believe that an institution or a leader or a pundit on TV is telling you something because it is borne out by his expertise or his view towards public welfare, whereas in fact he has an agenda that is not disclosed. And that you have little way of knowing. That's a violation of public trust.
Now, you write that many unseen elites are at work shaping public policy and exerting power beyond anyone's control. Is this a conspiracy?
Oh, no, decidedly not. It is absolutely not a conspiracy. First of all, conspiracies are secret, and the players who are shaping our world are they are often in the public eye. They are in the public eye. They're on TV. They're advocating this or that position. It's just that, and they're identified as an expert or a former Homeland Security chief or a former Senate Majority Leader, whatever the case may be. They're identified by those roles or former roles, but they're not identified as being with the company that they're currently with, or having the affiliation or 3 affiliations that they currently have that might give them an agenda that might give them a reason not to have a different agenda than the one that they're presented as having, which is that they're experts on subject X.
Right. Okay. Is one of the problems in making public and economic policy that only short-term results are rewarded and the long-term is ignored?
Of course, and the time frame for what is short-term and what is long-term has been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. We now have 24/7 media cycles. We have success that's measured almost instantaneously in terms of likes. We have rating systems, whether we're talking about the educational system or whether we're talking about media or finance, that are thought about in terms of the very short term. Actions and impact are measured in hours, minutes, or even microseconds, and it's very damaging to society when you think about it, because if you're a teacher and you're being evaluated on in terms of whether how your students score on standardized tests. First of all, the tests may not be a good measure of what they're learning, but secondly, you have a very specific, very short time frame within which to actually turn around a situation that may have started off being very difficult. So it may not be at all an accurate a judge of what's going on. If you're running a project, what happens is that your incentive is to show success, is to show results. So what it does is it puts an emphasis on appearances over what things seem to be, as opposed to what they actually may be, the underlying realities. And in a roundabout way, an obsessive emphasis on transparency. Transparency is a good thing, but if it's emphasized at the expense of underlying realities, like just show us transparency, show us results right now, then it can actually be counterproductive.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Janine Wedel, professor at George Mason University, and we're talking about her new book, Unaccountable: How Elite Power Brokers Corrupt Our Finances, Freedom, and Security. How does the news media contribute to unaccountability? You seem to compare Soviet propaganda with the mainstream media in the U.S. How so?
Well, okay, so that's a bit of a stretch. What I would say is that there's a formulaic nature about some of the mainstream media. When you watch Jon Stewart, he points this out. He will show that he'll show a series of news outlets who use exactly the same words to describe the phenomenon. So there's a formulaic quality that the same mantras get repeated over and over, and that's certainly a characteristic of communist style propaganda. And what people then do is that they go to parody, because in parody it turns out that you can tell in these kinds of environments you can be more truthful, you can say more of the truth than you can in this formulaic environment. Now, how has this come about? Well, it's come about because of new information technologies, which have served over 20 years to really gut investigative reporting. Of course, that was exacerbated by the financial crisis and what's 2008 and what's happened is that it's major news organizations like CNN or ABC or what they don't have the money to actually investigate stories as much as they used to, and so what tends to happen is that they bring on more commentators. They bring on what are called talking heads. And who are those talking heads? Those talking heads may be, the former Senate Majority Leader, or they may be the former Homeland Security Chief, being presented as such, and without disclosing what some of the other agendas, those players might have. So they are what I call shadow lobbyists. That is, people who are lobbying for a position, are not registered or trying to have influence, are being paid to have influence for the most part on public policy, are not registering that, and are being presented as something else. So they're being presented as an expert on X or Y.
Mm-hmm.
So the lack of investigative reporting and the fact that shadow lobbyists on the air often take their place. And keep in mind that we now have 24/7 news cycles. So producers have to keep the airwaves, have to keep somebody on the airwaves at all times. And that really creates many more opportunities for shadow lobbyists, not to mention that there are many more news outlets and many more venues for them to participate. And we all know how search engines can be gamed by people who have the resources to game them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And shadow lobbyists, by definition, have those resources. So,
what about the greater use of social media? Is that a possible answer to whatever's wrong with the mainstream media and holding the powerful accountable?
Well, it's certainly. I mean, there are aspects of social. There are aspects of media that can, and aspects of social media that can be helpful in aiding disclosure, but it's certainly, as I've just described, not at all a panacea. So much of it is driven by not by real news, but by likes and page views, which shape what becomes news. Right?
Yeah.
And so much, as I've just discussed, so much more airtime and web space consists of mere performances. So what appears to be the truth as opposed to what is the truth. I mean, hence Stephen Colbert's term truthiness, right? It's what appears to be. That's about, he coined the term, I think, to describe what appears to be the truth and what people actually believe as truth. See, the listener is involved, right?
Yeah.
And that creates an entirely new dimension, so that when we click a like, or we click on a page and then it's recorded as as a viewer, then of course the so-called news is going to report about it because they know that their livelihood depends on it. And so it's a kind of mad cycle, and the way out is not immediately apparent, I think.
Janine Wedel is a professor at George Mason University, author of a new book, Unaccountable: How Elite Power Brokers Corrupt Our Finances, Freedom, and Security, joining us today here on americasdemocrats.org. Janine, thank you so much for your time. Very interesting stuff. I hope we figure this out, and I hope we figure it out soon.
So do I. Thank you very much.
Okay, it was great talking to you.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, climate expert Joe Romm of the Center for American Progress.
Reporters, those of us covering the White House, we were told ahead of time not to expect too much coming out of the summit talks between President Obama and President Xi of China. And yet it turned out there was a big deal in a climate change agreement. Joe Romm, editor of Climate Progress over at the Center for American Progress, joins us on a newsline this morning. We always turn to him when there's news of climate change. Hey, Joe, good to talk to you again.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so what does this agreement require of, what did they agree to when they signed this agreement?
Well, the big part of it is China, which has been responsible for 60% of total world emissions growth in the past 15 years. 60%.
Wow.
Is going to peak. It said it will stop growing its emissions by the year 2030, and it's going to try to even do it sooner. So that's a big deal. And in addition, they said they would basically double the amount of carbon-free energy that they were producing by 2030, which is the equivalent of so much taking the entire U.S. power grid, having it be carbon-free, and sticking it in China.
Whoa.
So huge agreements on the Chinese side.
And on our side?
What the president said is that he would achieve the U.S., which had previously said it would reduce emissions by 17% by 2020, is now going to reduce emissions by 26 to 28% by 2025, which is basically doubling the rate of emissions reductions over the next 10 to 15 years.
So what did Mitch McConnell mean yesterday when he said this doesn't require China to do anything for the next 15 or 16 years?
Well, he's Mitch McConnell, so...
All right, got that.
You know, we generally, whatever he says, we assume the opposite is true. Clearly, you have a country with 1 billion people that is growing rapidly. For it to go from being the biggest, responsible for most of the growth in CO2 emissions to the world, to not growing at all, that's going to take an awful lot of action by China. They're going to have to completely redo their energy system, and you can't just wait until the year 2029 to do that. So they're going to build massive amounts of clean energy. They're going to start importing a lot of Russian gas and replacing coal with gas. Obviously, their local air pollution is a nightmare.
Yeah.
So they're not just doing this out of the goodness of their heart. You can't breathe in Beijing anymore. So they're going to, be hard at work for 15 years. And like I said, one of the things in this agreement, is China said it's going to try to peak before 2030, and most of the Chinese experts that I talked to expect that they will in fact peak a few years earlier, and they haven't exactly figured out when they might do it, so they didn't want to put a number out there. But this is a big deal. It's particularly a big deal because it was the president of China making the announcement. He was there with world leaders and the president of the United States. So this is not like, people say, well, this isn't binding. Well, that's not the way the Chinese operate. You make this kind of grand public announcement as part of a deal with the United States. It's because you're planning to do this.
So you think we can trust the Chinese to live up to this agreement?
Well,
Xi is not going to be there for a long time, forever, and neither is President Obama.
No, well, I think people have to understand that a climate deal, there was never going to be, a policing, how many international treaties, if you don't meet them, does the world swoop in and take over it just doesn't happen.
Exactly.
The basis of dealing with climate change is the recognition that it's actually in every country's interest to not destroy a livable climate. To not have sea levels raise and not, turn your cropland into a dust bowl. So the reason the Chinese are going to meet this is because it's in their interest. The reason, the interesting thing is this really puts the Republicans on the spot, because this has been their only remaining reasonable argument for doing nothing, which is, well, China will never do anything. and therefore anything the U.S. does doesn't matter. Now, Obama has said everything the U.S. is doing is part of a deal to get China to do a massive amount. Right. So now the Republicans, could go around saying, well, EPA regulations, it's government overreach and blah, blah, blah. But now all the EPA efforts to all the Republican efforts to roll back the EPA carbon pollution standards are in fact an attack on this deal and a serious effort by the world to actually prevent catastrophes. So this really, really raises the stakes on what we're doing in this country, and I think it just pulls the rug out from underneath the entire Republican argument.
And the opportunity for all nations to join in this is next year, correct? The Global Summit?
The reason why you heard this announcement is that in December 2015, or over the next 13 months, the nations of the world are going to be negotiating a deal that they are going to attempt to finalize in Paris in December 2015. And so far, we have this U.S. China announcement, and then a few weeks ago we had the entire European Union said that they would cut carbon pollution by 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, and would also massively expand their renewable energy. So we now have countries representing literally over half of global carbon pollution who have put very serious offers on the table. So yes, one of the points of this by both the U.S. and China was to put pressure on other countries to say, we're serious, what are you guys going to do? And so this makes a global deal, I think, far more likely, which is obviously, a very good thing, because climate change is probably the biggest threat facing the planet.
Absolutely. Such an important agreement. I'm just glad to see some attention to this issue and some real progress being made. I know you are too, Joe, and you can follow Joe Romm. By the way, I just want to shout out to John Podesta too. We know this is his agenda. This is his job at the White House, and he certainly delivered on this one. And I know all of you at the Center for American Progress are very proud of John Podesta and his work too.
This is a very big deal, and from my point of view, it may be Podesta's single biggest accomplishment, and he has a career of accomplishing a great deal. This is a very, very big deal, and even if it isn't getting on Morning Joe or whatever, you guys are covering it. We know that this is one of the biggest announcements in climate in many, many years.
Absolutely. Hey, Joe, so good to have you with us. Thanks so much again. Joe Romm at the Center for American Progress, AmericanProgress.org.
That's all for AmericasDemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Joel Kotkin, Janine Wedel, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For AmericasDemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate.